The notification sound cut through the rumble of 40 Harley-Davidson engines like a knife. Tommy "Tank" Rodriguez felt his phone vibrate against his chest. The GPS tracker app he'd been monitoring for 3 days, finally showing movement. His missing nephew wasn't just a statistic anymore. The kid was somewhere in the industrial district, and that ping was coming from inside a corrugated metal shed that had no business housing anything but rust and forgotten dreams. Tank raised his fist, and 40 bikes began to slow. The Bandidos MC had been riding together for over 2 decades, but this wasn't about territory or club business. This was about family, and in their world, family meant everything. 16-year-old Miguel had vanished from his high school parking lot 4 days ago, and the police had already started using words like runaway and probably just acting out. But Tank knew better. The kid had been getting threats, talking about some older guys who'd been pressuring him into things he didn't want to do. The GPS coordinates led them through a maze of abandoned warehouses and forgotten industrial lots. This wasn't the kind of place where good things happened, especially not to scared teenagers who'd been grabbed off the street. Tank's jaw tightened as he remembered the last conversation he'd had with Miguel. The boy had been frightened, talking about men who wouldn't take no for an answer, men who made promises that sounded more like threats. The shed sat isolated at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by nothing but weeds and broken chain-link fencing. No cars were visible, but that didn't mean they were alone. Tank had learned long ago that the most dangerous situations were often the quietest ones, the places where screams couldn't be heard and help couldn't find you. As 40 engines fell silent in the growing dusk, Tank knew they were about to discover just how far some people would go to protect what mattered most. If you're enjoying this story of brotherhood and protection, hit that subscribe button and let's ride together through this journey. The bikers dismounted with practiced silence. 40 years of collective experience, teaching them that sometimes the loudest statement was made without sound. Tank assigned positions with hand signals, perimeter security, rear exit coverage, and a core team for entry. These weren't weekend warriors playing dress-up. These were men who'd served in conflicts overseas, worked dangerous jobs, and understood that when innocent lives hung in the balance, there was no room for mistakes or hesitation. Miguel's GPS signal pulsed steadily from inside the structure, but something felt wrong. The shed was too quiet, too isolated, and the single access road they'd used was the only way in or out. Tank had seen enough ambushes to recognize the setup, but they'd come too far to turn back now. His nephew was inside that building, and every minute they waited was another minute the kid remained in danger. Brother Diesel Martinez, a former Marine with 2 tours in Afghanistan, took point on reconnaissance. He moved like a shadow despite his imposing frame, circling the building and reporting back through subtle gestures. 2 vehicles hidden behind the structure, fresh tire tracks in the dirt, and the faint glow of artificial light seeping through gaps in the corrugated walls. Someone was definitely home, and they weren't expecting company. The plan formed quickly through silent communication. No phones, no radios, nothing that could give away their position or intentions. 6 men would breach the front while others covered escape routes. Tank insisted on being first through the door. This was his family, his responsibility, and his burden to bear if things went sideways. As they approached the shed, the sound of muffled voices drifted through the thin walls. Tank's blood ran cold when he heard a younger voice, scared and pleading. Miguel was alive, but for how much longer? The next few minutes would determine whether they were rescuing a kidnapping victim or recovering a body, and failure simply wasn't an option they could accept. The door exploded inward with a crash that echoed through the night like thunder. Tank led the charge, his massive frame filling the doorway as his eyes adjusted to the harsh fluorescent lighting inside. What he saw made his stomach turn, and his rage ignite like gasoline meeting flame. Miguel sat zip-tied to a metal chair, his face bruised and swollen, while 3 men in expensive suits stood around him like vultures circling carrion. The kidnapper's shock lasted exactly 2 seconds before training kicked in on both sides. These weren't random street thugs. They moved with military precision, reaching for weapons concealed beneath tailored jackets. But 40 bikers had anticipated this moment, and their response was swift and overwhelming. Diesel tackled the nearest gunman before his weapon cleared leather, while Tank charged straight toward his nephew, using his body as a shield against any potential crossfire. "Miguel, stay down, kid!" Tank's voice boomed through the chaos as zip ties were cut and the teenager pulled to safety behind an overturned table. The boy was conscious but clearly traumatized, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and relief. Tank did a quick assessment. Bruises, dehydration, but nothing that looked life-threatening. The kid would heal, but the men responsible for putting him here were about to learn what real consequences looked like. The confrontation lasted less than 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. Professional kidnappers were dangerous, but they weren't prepared for the coordinated assault of men who'd spent decades watching each other's backs. Within moments, all 3 captors were subdued, their weapons secured, and their plans permanently disrupted. The shed fell silent except for Miguel's shaky breathing and the distant rumble of Harley engines still running outside. Tank knelt beside his nephew, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he checked for serious injuries. The boy was alive, conscious, and relatively unharmed. Everything else could be dealt with later. But as he looked into Miguel's frightened eyes, Tank realized this rescue was only the beginning of a much larger story about justice, family, and the lengths people would go to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Miguel's story came out in fragments between sobs and shaking hands. The men weren't random kidnappers. They were part of a larger operation targeting teenagers from working-class families, kids whose disappearances wouldn't generate headlines or massive police investigations. They'd been watching Miguel for weeks, learning his routines, identifying his vulnerabilities, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The teenager had been grabbed not for ransom, but for something far worse. Tank's jaw clenched as the details emerged. This was human trafficking, a modern slavery operation that preyed on the most vulnerable members of society. Miguel had been selected because he fit a profile, young, male, from a single-parent household where his mother worked multiple jobs and couldn't monitor his every movement. The kidnappers had planned to transport him across state lines within hours, selling him to buyers who would ensure he was never seen again. The evidence was overwhelming and sickening. Laptops containing databases of potential targets, photographs of other missing teenagers, and communication records with buyers across the country. This wasn't the work of amateurs or opportunists. This was a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been operating for years, destroying lives and families while generating enormous profits for those heartless enough to participate. Diesel discovered a shipping container behind the shed, outfitted with restraints and basic life support equipment. The implications were clear. Miguel wasn't their first victim, and he wouldn't have been their last. Tank felt his hands shake with barely controlled rage as he realized how close they'd come to losing the boy forever. If the GPS tracker hadn't worked, if they'd arrived an hour later, Miguel would have vanished into a nightmare from which there was no return. The 3 captured men remained silent, despite aggressive questioning, but their phones and computers told the story their mouths wouldn't. Names, locations, schedules, and financial records painted a picture of an operation that stretched across multiple states and involved dozens of victims. Tank realized they'd stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple kidnapping, something that would require careful handling and serious consequences. What they did next would determine whether justice was served or whether more families would suffer the same nightmare. The scope of the trafficking operation became clearer as Tank and his brothers methodically searched through the digital evidence. Dozens of faces stared back from computer screens, teenagers who'd been reported missing over the past 2 years, their cases growing cold as police resources were stretched thin and leads dried up. Miguel's photograph was among them, already uploaded to what appeared to be an auction site where human beings were bought and sold like livestock. Tank recognized several faces from missing person flyers he'd seen around town. Maria Santos, 17, vanished from a bus stop 6 months ago. David Chen, 16, disappeared after his shift at a local grocery store. Jennifer Williams, 15, never made it home from school one Friday afternoon. Each photo represented a family destroyed, parents who went to bed every night wondering if their child was alive or dead, siblings who grew up in the shadow of unimaginable loss. The financial records revealed the true horror of the operation's success. Bank transfers, cryptocurrency transactions, and coded communications showed millions of dollars changing hands. Each transaction represented a life stolen, a future destroyed, a family's worst nightmare transformed into someone else's profit margin. Tank had seen evil in many forms throughout his life, but this calculated destruction of innocence made his blood run cold. Brother Wrench Patterson, whose day job involved computer forensics for a private investigation firm, worked methodically through the digital evidence. The operation had been running for at least 3 years, with victims transported to buyers across the country and internationally. The sophistication was staggering. Fake identification documents, safe houses, transportation networks, and corrupt officials who looked the other way for the right price. As the full scope became apparent, Tank realized they faced an impossible choice. Turning everything over to law enforcement was the legal path, but it would also mean watching the evidence disappear into bureaucratic processes that could take years to produce results. Meanwhile, more kids would vanish, more families would be destroyed, and the people responsible would adapt their methods to avoid detection. Sometimes justice required taking risks that good people shouldn't have to take. If you're feeling the weight of this story, drop a comment below about what justice means to you. The vote was unanimous, but it wasn't taken lightly. 40 men stood in a circle around their motorcycles as Tank presented the evidence and the options. They could call the police and hope the system worked, knowing that previous cases had resulted in plea bargains and reduced sentences. They could walk away and pretend they'd never seen the scope of the operation, protecting themselves but abandoning other potential victims. Or they could take direct action, accepting the personal risks that came with ensuring real justice was served. Diesel spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of military service and personal loss. "My daughter's the same age as some of these kids. If someone took her, I'd want people who gave a damn to step up and do what needed doing." The sentiment echoed around the circle as other fathers, uncles, and brothers shared their own connections to the victims in those photographs. This wasn't about vigilante justice or playing hero. It was about protecting the innocent when the system failed them. The plan that emerged was methodical and precise. They would document everything, create multiple copies of all evidence, and ensure that even if something happened to them, the information would reach people who could act on it. But they wouldn't wait for bureaucrats and prosecutors to decide whether justice was worth pursuing. The trafficking network had locations in 3 states, and each site would be visited by men who understood that some crimes demanded immediate consequences. Tank assigned teams based on skills and geography. Former military members would handle the more dangerous locations, while those with technical expertise would focus on dismantling the digital infrastructure. Everyone understood the risks. They were crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed, making choices that would define them for the rest of their lives. But as they looked at Miguel, still shaking but alive, they knew they couldn't live with themselves if they chose the safe path, while other kids suffered. The brotherhood that had formed around shared love of motorcycles and freedom was about to be tested in ways they'd never imagined. They were no longer just bikers enjoying weekend rides and club meetings. They were men who'd decided that some things were worth risking everything to protect. The next phase would determine whether their commitment to justice was stronger than their fear of consequences. Over the next 72 hours, the Bandidos MC became an unstoppable force of righteous fury. 3 safe houses across 2 states were simultaneously raided by coordinated teams who moved with military precision. 12 additional victims were recovered, ranging in age from 14 to 19, each one representing a family that would be reunited and a future that could still be salvaged from the wreckage of human greed. The traffickers' network collapsed like a house of cards once its key locations were compromised. Financial accounts were emptied and donated to organizations that helped trafficking survivors. Transportation vehicles were disabled or destroyed. Communication networks were infiltrated and shut down. Most importantly, the people responsible for orchestrating the operation found themselves facing consequences that no lawyer could negotiate away and no judge could reduce. Tank personally delivered copies of all evidence to federal investigators, local police departments, and investigative journalists who specialized in exposing human trafficking operations. The digital trail was so comprehensive that prosecutions would be inevitable. even without the direct testimony of the men who'd gathered it. The legal system would have its chance to work, but it would be working with cases that were already solved and criminals who were already neutralized. Miguel's recovery became a symbol of hope for other families whose children had vanished into the trafficking network. Reunions happened across the country as recovered victims were returned to parents who'd never stopped believing they would see their children again. The psychological healing would take time, but the physical danger was over, and the people responsible would never threaten another child. The 3 men who'd held Miguel in that shed were found by police, along with detailed confessions and evidence that would ensure they spent the rest of their lives behind bars. Their cooperation with investigators led to additional arrests and the dismantling of trafficking networks in other regions. The ripple effects of one GPS ping and 40 determined bikers continued to spread, saving lives and delivering justice to those who'd thought themselves untouchable. 6 months later, Tank stood in his nephew's high school gymnasium, watching Miguel walk across the stage to receive his diploma. The bruises had healed, the nightmares had faded, and the boy who'd been zip-tied to a chair in a forgotten shed was now planning for college and a future that almost didn't exist. The graduation ceremony represented more than academic achievement. It was proof that evil doesn't always win, that sometimes good people step up when it matters most. The Bandidos MC had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Their weekend rides now included stops at schools and community centers, where they talked to teenagers about personal safety and the warning signs of predatory behavior. They'd partnered with law enforcement agencies to provide training on human trafficking recognition, sharing hard-won knowledge that could help prevent other families from experiencing the nightmare they'd confronted. Miguel himself had become an advocate for trafficking survivors, using his experience to help other victims understand that recovery was possible and that they weren't defined by what had been done to them. His testimony had helped convict dozens of criminals and had inspired legislation that strengthened penalties for human trafficking. The scared teenager who'd been rescued from that shed had grown into a young man who understood the power of turning trauma into purpose. The brotherhood forged in those desperate 72 hours had created something lasting and meaningful. They'd learned that being protectors meant more than just looking tough or riding loud motorcycles. It meant being willing to sacrifice comfort, safety, and even freedom when innocent lives hung in the balance. Their leather jackets and club patches had become symbols of hope for people who needed to know that someone cared enough to fight for them. As Tank watched his nephew shake hands with the school principal, he reflected on the choice they'd made that night when 40 engines fell silent outside a corrugated shed. They'd chosen to act when action was needed, to protect when protection was required, and to deliver justice when the system failed. It wasn't always the safe choice, but it was always the right choice. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of brotherhood, courage, and the people who stand up when it matters most. Because sometimes the most important battles are fought by ordinary people who refuse to look the other way when evil thinks it's winning.